the long story of American organized crime, there are names that everyone remembers: Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, John Gotti. But hidden in the shadows of those giants was another man whose life was no less fascinating, no less tragic. His name was Frank Nitti, born as Francesco Raffaele Nitto in 1886, in the small Italian town of Angri, near Salerno. His story begins not in the streets of Chicago, but in a struggling household in southern Italy, where poverty was common and opportunity was rare. When Frank was still a child, his family, like many other Italian families of that era, looked to America as the land of hope and fortune. They packed their belongings, braved the Atlantic, and settled in Brooklyn, New York. For young Frank, America was both a promise and a challenge. Life was not easy for an immigrant family at the turn of the century. Prejudice against Italians was widespread, jobs were scarce, and survival often depended on doing whatever work came your way. Frank dropped out of school early, something not unusual among immigrant kids. Education was a luxury when food on the table was uncertain. He worked small jobs to help his family. For a while, he became a pin setter in a bowling alley. Later, he learned barbering, a trade that gave him a steady hand and an eye for detail. He was a quiet man, not one to brag, but those who knew him remembered his sharp looks and neat style. Yet beneath that calm surface, Frank was already drifting toward the shadowy world of crime. By his teenage years, Frank had figured out that the real money wasn't in cutting hair. It was in moving goods that weren't supposed to be moved. He became a fence, someone who bought and sold stolen jewelry and property. In those backroom deals, in the dark corners of immigrant neighborhoods, Frank learned two things: how to keep quiet and how to keep connections. Both skills would define his rise in the underworld. Still, Brooklyn wasn't where his destiny lay. Around the 1910s, Frank Nitti moved west to Chicago, a city that was exploding with opportunity, both legal and illegal. Chicago was booming with immigrants, industry, and corruption. Politicians were for sale, police could be bought, and the criminal underworld was already flourishing. For a man like Nitti, it was the perfect place to build a new life. At first, he kept up the barber trade. He opened a small barber shop, cutting hair during the day, while quietly running side hustles in stolen jewelry. But when Prohibition hit in 1920, everything changed. Suddenly, the sale of alcohol became illegal, and with one stroke of the law, a multi-million-dollar underground economy was born. It was the golden age for bootleggers, smugglers, and gangsters. Chicago became the epicenter of it all. Frank Nitti slipped naturally into this new world. His calm personality and sharp organizational skills made him different from the average street thug. While others fought openly with fists and guns, Frank thought in terms of systems. He built routes to smuggle liquor from Canada, secured warehouses for storage, and set up delivery lines to speakeasies all over Chicago. In a business where betrayal was common, Frank understood the value of reliability. If you worked with Nitti, you could count on him to deliver. It was this professionalism that drew the attention of the rising stars of Chicago's underworld, Johnny Torrio and his protégé, Al Capone. Torrio, the strategist, and Capone, the charismatic enforcer, were building an empire, and they needed men like Nitti to keep the machine running. Frank was brought into the fold, and soon his reputation began to grow. He wasn't the loud one in the room, nor the one making headlines in the papers. He was the man behind the curtain, making sure the money kept flowing. The shipments kept arriving, and the right people got paid. He handled payoffs to police and politicians, kept track of payrolls for hundreds of outfit members, and ensured that Capone's empire ran like a business. For this reason, he became known as the Enforcer, not only because he could order violence when needed, but because he enforced the discipline of the organization itself. In the streets of Chicago, violence was everywhere. Rival gangs fought for control of territory and the state. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 became the most infamous example of how bloody the bootlegging wars had become. Yet Frank Nitti avoided the spotlight of direct violence. He wasn't the man pulling the trigger in a back alley. He was the one making sure the hitman got paid afterward, and that the system of fear and loyalty remained intact. What made Nitti stand out was his ability to balance brutality with brains. He could authorize a beating or a murder when necessary, but he also knew the power of politics and business connections. Under Capone, Frank handled much of the importing of alcohol from Canada, creating networks that stretched across state lines. By the late 1920s, Frank Nitti had become one of Capone's most trusted lieutenants, a man the boss could rely on when things got complicated. Yet the world of organized crime was never stable. Cops were always watching, newspapers were always chasing headlines, and rivals were always scheming. Nitti's challenge was to stay in the shadows while running operations that were worth millions. He succeeded for years, but the higher he rose, the greater the risks became. By the dawn of the 1930s, Frank Nitti was no longer just a quiet barber from Brooklyn. He was a key pillar of the Chicago outfit, the financial brain and logistical backbone of Al Capone's empire. His life had transformed from poverty in Italy to power in America. But with that power came enemies, police investigations, and a pressure that would only increase as the years went by. This was only the beginning of Frank Nitti's story. In the next chapter, we will see how he stepped out of Capone's shadow, how prison changed him forever, and how he tried to steer the Chicago outfit through the turbulent years after his boss was gone. The year was 1931, and the mighty Al Capone, the man who had ruled Chicago with money, muscle, and fear, finally faced the one enemy he could not outwit: the United States government. After years of failed attempts to bring him down for murder, bootlegging, and racketeering, federal prosecutors used an unexpected weapon: tax evasion. When Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the underworld held its breath. The empire that stretched across Chicago suddenly stood without its king. In the shadows, Frank Nitti was waiting. For years, he had been Capone's most trusted lieutenant, the quiet man who kept the books balanced and the payroll flowing. Now, with Capone behind bars, someone had to step forward. The newspapers quickly began to whisper, "Nitti is the new boss. On the streets, the story was more complicated. Paul Ricca Tony Accardo and Murray Humphreys, powerful figures within the outfit, were not about to hand over complete control to a man they considered more of a manager than a visionary. Still, it was Nitty's name that surfaced, and for all practical purposes, he became the figurehead of the Chicago outfit. He wasn't the flamboyant leader Capone had been. He didn't crave attention, didn't court the press, and rarely showed his face in public. Instead, he ruled quietly, preferring to sit in the background, issuing orders through trusted lieutenants. To many, this was a strength. In a city wary of headlines about gangland murders, Nitty's low profile kept the outfit alive while law enforcement remained distracted. But the pressure was mounting. Just like Capone, Nitty was not free from the long arm of the government. In the same year as Capone's trial, Nitty too was indicted on income tax charges. His sentence was lighter, 18 months, but for a man like Frank Nitti, even a short prison term carried a heavy cost. It was inside those prison walls that he developed a condition that would haunt him for the rest of his life: severe claustrophobia, the confinement, the lack of open space, the feeling of being trapped. It broke something inside him. He would never be the same again. When he was released in 1932, Frank Nitti returned to the streets determined to never set foot in a prison cell again. He resumed control of the outfit's operations, overseeing gambling, loan sharking, and most importantly, the transition away from bootlegging. Prohibition was coming to an end, and with it, the river of money that had fueled Chicago's underworld. If the outfit wanted to survive, it needed new sources of income. Nitty's answer was labor racketeering. He and his associates began infiltrating labor unions across the city. Dock workers, truck drivers, theater projectionists all became pawns in the outfit's expanding game. With control over unions, Nitti could threaten strikes, slow down industries, and then sell labor peace to desperate businessmen. It was a sophisticated form of extortion, one that required brains more than bullets. In this, Nitti excelled. But Chicago was not a city where things ever stayed calm. In December of 1932, a violent event nearly ended Nitty's reign. Police officers raided his office in the Chicago Loop, and in the chaos, Detective Harry Lang fired multiple shots at Nitti, striking him 3 times in the back and neck. Newspapers reported that Nitti had tried to shoot first, but the story quickly unraveled. Witnesses testified that it was Detective Lang who had pulled the trigger without provocation, later shooting himself in the arm to cover his tracks. Nitti survived, though barely. The bullets left him hospitalized for months, his body weakened, but his resolve stronger. When the case finally reached trial, Lang's version of the story fell apart, and Nitti was acquitted. In the streets of Chicago, the shooting only added to his legend. If the police wanted him dead and failed, it meant he was a man too dangerous, too powerful, to be taken down so easily. By now, Frank Nitti was firmly at the helm of the outfit. He avoided the limelight, but ensured that money kept flowing into the organization. The outfit diversified. illegal gambling dens, extortion rackets, and most significantly, the new venture that would bring them immense wealth, Hollywood. By controlling unions in Los Angeles, Nitti and his crew began to squeeze the movie industry itself. For every major studio, labor strikes were a nightmare, costing millions in lost revenue. With the outfit's men inside the unions, they had the power to trigger strikes or to prevent them. The price for labor peace was protection money, and the studios paid. Still, the fear of prison lingered. Every federal indictment, every new investigation, sent Nitti spiraling into paranoia. His claustrophobia, a scar from his earlier time behind bars, grew worse with each passing year. He could handle the threat of rival gangs, the possibility of being shot in the street, but the idea of another prison sentence was unbearable, and that fear was not unfounded. Law enforcement, emboldened by Capone's conviction, kept a close watch on Nitti. Federal investigators saw in him the logical successor to Capone, and they were determined not to let the outfit rebuild itself so easily. Meanwhile, inside the outfit, tension simmered. Some saw Nitti as a steady hand, the man who kept them afloat in hard times. Others saw him as weak, a placeholder for stronger figures like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo. What cannot be denied is that under Nitti's leadership, the outfit adapted. They were no longer just bootlickers. They were extortionists, gamblers, and businessmen in the shadows. Their grip reached beyond Chicago, stretching into Hollywood and beyond. The empire lived on, even as its leader struggled under the weight of his own fears. By the mid-1930s, Frank Nitti had secured his place as one of the most important figures in organized crime. Yet, with every year, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The government was watching. Rivals were circling. And deep inside, Frank Nitti knew that the greatest threat to his power was not outside. It was within his own mind. The story of Frank Nitti was now entering its darkest phase. In the next chapter, we will witness the height of his influence, the Hollywood extortion schemes that shook the film industry, and the unbearable pressure that would eventually push him toward a tragic end. By the late 1930s, Frank Nitti had become a symbol of quiet control in Chicago's underworld. While the days of open gang wars and prohibition shootouts were fading into history, the Chicago outfit was far from finished. In fact, under Nitti's direction, it was evolving into something even more dangerous. An empire that reached far beyond the smoky bars of Chicago and into the very heart of Hollywood. The logic was simple: unions meant power, and whoever controlled the unions controlled entire industries. Nitti and his lieutenants had already proven this in Chicago by taking hold of truck drivers, dock workers, and theater projectionists. If a studio in Los Angeles tried to push back, the outfit could order a strike. A production shutdown could cost a studio millions, and executives knew it. For the right price, however, labor peace could be guaranteed. Hollywood was glamorous on the surface: bright lights, red carpets, and golden statues. But behind that shine was fear. Studio bosses, men like Louis B. Mayer of MGM, found themselves negotiating not just with actors and directors, but with gangsters thousands of miles away. through trusted lieutenants such as Paul Ricca and Murray Humphreys. Nitty's network made sure that every major studio understood the cost of ignoring them. MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, none were beyond the outfit's reach. Frank Nitti himself rarely traveled to Hollywood. He didn't need to. His power was in his ability to manage from a distance. He kept the outfit's financial system intact, making sure that the extortion payments flowed steadily back to Chicago. In a sense, Hollywood became another tributary, feeding the river of cash that kept the outfit alive. But while money flowed, pressure mounted. The federal government, already proud of its victory against Capone, now turned its gaze toward Nitti. Investigators in Los Angeles and Chicago began collecting testimonies, probing union activity, and questioning suspicious payments. Reporters whispered about gangsters running Hollywood, and the FBI saw in Nitti the symbol of organized crime's evolution. Unlike Capone, he didn't flaunt his power, but the quiet hand that choked the film industry was just as dangerous. Inside the outfit, things were no easier. Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, both shrewd and ambitious, often overshadowed Nitti in strategic discussions. Some insiders believed that Nitti was a figurehead, a public face, while the true decisions were being made by Ricca. Yet the risk was always his. If indictments came, it would be his name, not Ricca's, in the headlines. That was the unspoken deal, Frank. Nitti would carry the weight of leadership, and with it, the burden of blame. This arrangement gnawed at him. His claustrophobia, born from those months in prison earlier in the decade, never left him. To most gangsters, prison was part of the life, a risk to be endured. But to Nitti, the very thought of a cell, of four walls closing in, was unbearable. The fear crept into his daily life. He avoided elevators, refused tight rooms, and often found himself sweating and trembling when confined. To the outside world, he remained calm, controlled, and calculating. Inside, he was unraveling. As the investigations into Hollywood deepened around 1941 and 1942, the threat of another prison term became very real. The federal government had assembled evidence of the outfit's extortion schemes, and the list of names involved was long. Studio executives, union leaders, and gangsters alike were being called to testify. In Chicago, Nitti could feel the walls closing in. He knew that if the case went to trial, someone in the outfit would have to take the fall, and many expected that man to be him. Paul Ricca and Murray Humphreys had no desire to sit in a federal courtroom. Tony Accardo, already seen as a rising star, was too valuable to risk. But Frank Nitti, the quiet, steady enforcer, was a convenient shield. If he went down, the outfit could go on. If he took the blame, the others could remain in the shadows. In the cold calculus of organized crime, sacrifice was survival. Nitti understood this. He had built his life on loyalty, on making sure the outfit ran smoothly, no matter the cost. But now, the cost was personal. Another prison sentence loomed, and for him, it was worse than death. The idea of being locked in a small cell again, trapped with his fear, was unbearable. By 1942, the government's case was tightening. Newspapers reported on the grand jury investigations, and Nitti's name was whispered in headlines once again. The Hollywood extortion scheme was no longer a secret. The glamour of the movie industry now carried a dark shadow, and at the center of that shadow stood Frank Nitti. Yet to the very end, he tried to keep the outfit steady. He continued to oversee gambling operations in Chicago, kept money flowing from the unions, and maintained the connections that had allowed the outfit to survive the fall of Capone. But the pressure never left him. Each night, as he sat in his modest Chicago home, he knew that federal agents could come knocking at any time. Friends and associates began to notice the change in him. Once calm and reserved, Nitti grew tense and irritable. The weight of leadership, the constant fear of prison, and the knowledge that he was being positioned as the fall guy all bore down on him. By the early months of 1943, the case was ready, indictments were filed, and the full force of the law was about to descend on Nitti and his associates. For him, the moment of reckoning had arrived. What made his story so tragic was not just the crimes he committed or the power he held. It was the quiet war inside his own mind. Frank Nitti, the man who enforced order, who managed empires, who brought Hollywood to its knees, was now battling an enemy he could not defeat, the prison inside himself. The next chapter will take us to those final days in 1943 when fear and pressure converged, and Frank Nitti made the decision that would end his life and seal his legacy in the dark history of American crime. March of 1943 was a month that would etch Frank Nitti's name permanently into the annals of organized crime. Not for a violent gangland execution, not for a bloody shootout, but for the quiet and tragic way his life ended. By then, the Hollywood extortion indictments had landed like a hammer on the outfit. The government had built its case, and the grand jury was ready to put some of Chicago's most powerful men on trial. Names like Paul Ricca, Johnny Roselli, and Louis Campagna appeared on the charging documents. Yet the one man everyone looked to as the shield, the one expected to carry the weight of it all, was Frank Nitti. For years he had been the stabilizer of the outfit. He had kept the machine running smoothly when Capone went to prison. He had turned labor unions into pipelines of wealth. He had ensured that the outfit transitioned from the chaos of prohibition into a more disciplined and profitable empire. But now, discipline and loyalty demanded that someone take the fall. And the unspoken consensus was clear. That man would be Nitti. On the morning of March 19, 1943, Frank Nitti rose early in his modest home in Riverside, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. The indictment had been filed the day before, and the newspapers carried his name. He knew federal agents would be coming for him soon. For most gangsters, prison was a risk of the trade, a price to be paid. But for Nitti, it was an impossible sentence. His claustrophobia haunted him relentlessly. The memory of his earlier stint behind bars, where walls had pressed in on him like a coffin, was more than he could bear. To him, a prison cell meant death in slow motion. That morning, his wife, Anna, noticed his nervous state. He drank heavily at breakfast, trying to steady his hands, but the liquor only fueled his agitation. Soon after, he grabbed his hat, put on his coat, and stepped outside into the cold March air. In his pocket was a revolver. Nitti walked toward the railroad tracks that ran near his neighborhood. Witnesses later recalled seeing him staggering slightly, muttering to himself, and clutching the gun. He was drunk, but his mind was clear enough to know what he intended. The fear of prison had consumed him, and in his world of ruthless pragmatism, there was only one escape. At a quiet spot near the tracks, he raised the revolver to his head. The first attempt misfired. Whether from shaky hands or faulty ammunition, no one knew. He tried again, firing into the side of his head, but the bullet only grazed his temple. Bleeding, disoriented, but determined, he staggered forward a few steps. With the third shot pressed under his chin, Frank Nitti ended his life. The sound of gunfire drew nearby residents. They found him collapsed along the tracks, his revolver beside him, his hat lying in the dirt. The once feared enforcer of the Chicago outfit was gone, not at the hands of rivals or federal agents, but by his own choice. News of his suicide spread quickly. The press had a field day. T-Pone's successor takes own life blared the headlines. Reporters painted him as a tragic figure, the gangster who feared prison more than death itself. Federal prosecutors, stunned by the timing, realized their primary defendant would never face trial. Within the outfit, reactions were mixed. Some mourned the loss of a loyal enforcer. Others saw it as a necessary sacrifice that cleared the way for Ricca and Accardo to lead without distraction. His funeral was modest by gangster standards. Unlike Capone, who had gone out in a blaze of notoriety, Nitti slipped quietly into history. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, the same ground that would hold the remains of many other outfit figures. To some, his grave was just another marker in the long line of Chicago mobsters. To others, it symbolized the silent cost of leadership, the price of carrying the outfit's burdens until they became unbearable. But what was Frank Nitti's legacy? On one hand, he was the man who proved that organized crime could survive beyond prohibition. While Capone embodied the flash and fury of the gangster era, Nitti represented something more insidious: stability, continuity, and quiet control. He understood that the future of the outfit was not in shootouts or bootleg beer, but in industries, unions, and rackets that reached into everyday American life. His Hollywood extortion scheme was a perfect example. By exploiting labor unions, he brought an entire industry to heel. On the other hand, Nitti's legacy is also a story of vulnerability. Unlike the untouchable image of the mob boss, he was haunted by very human fears. His claustrophobia, his terror of imprisonment, and his reliance on alcohol in his final days paint a picture not of a cold, blooded villain, but of a man trapped between loyalty to his organization and the demons inside his own mind. His suicide showed that even gangsters, who often seemed larger than life, could be crushed by fear. For the outfit, his death marked a turning point. With Nitti gone, Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo assumed greater control. They steered the organization through the mid-20th century, keeping it powerful for decades to come. In many ways, the modern mob owed its survival to the foundation Nitti had helped build. He was not remembered with the same notoriety as Capone, nor did he inspire the same cultural fascination as later figures like Sam Giancana. But his role was no less important. He was the bridge between eras, the man who kept the empire alive during its most uncertain years. Today, Frank Nitti's story is often overshadowed by the larger than life legends of organized crime. Yet in the quiet corners of history, his tale endures as a reminder that power in the underworld was not always about violence and spectacle. Sometimes it was about patience management and the ability to make others pay without firing a shot. And in the end, his downfall was not the gun of a rival, nor the gavel of a judge, but the weight of his own fears. Frank Nitti lived in the shadows of Al Capone, but he carved his own place in the dark legacy of American crime. He kept the outfit alive, he extended its reach into new territories, and he showed that even empires built on fear could be managed with quiet precision. Yet he also showed the world that even the most feared gangsters were still human, and that fear, when left unchecked, could be deadlier than any bullet. Thus ended the life of Frank Nitti, the enforcer who became the boss, the man who took Hollywood hostage, and the gangster who chose death over a prison cell. His story, woven into the fabric of Chicago's criminal history, remains a haunting reminder of the fragile line between power and despair,